it's really addressed to me. It says you published the first edition of the Pronunciation Dictionary about 10 years ago. What do you think is the shortest span of time for changes in pronunciation to come into effect? And which changes most, or should we say fastest, in language, pronunciation, meaning, or grammar? The problem is one of measuring things. How can you possibly compare like with like if we're talking about pronunciation changes, grammar changes, and vocabulary changes? Well, it's difficult. Let's start off with pronunciation changes then, because fortunately I have got one or two facts to bring in, at least as far as the question of individual words is concerned, because there are at least two words that I had in my 1988 survey, and I've also got in my 1998 survey, so 10 years apart. This, for example, applies to the question of the stress placement in the word that is either controversy or controversy. Now, in 1988, 56% of my sample voted for controversy. 10 years later, it was 60% for controversy, which means that there was an increase in 4%. Now, they may not be absolutely comparable samples and so on, but let's ignore that. That suggests a change of 4% in 10 years, which means 40% in 100 years, which means 100% in 250 years. So that particular item looks as if it would take 250 years to go from the first few people to say controversy until everybody says controversy. Of course, life is not like that. But anyhow, the other word that, again, we could extrapolate from is kilometre or kilometre, where, again, for the first survey, it was 48% voted for kilometre. By the time of the second one, it was 57%. So the balance has changed, and that's actually a 9% change, again, in only 10 years. Now, if we gross that up, it means you get 100% in just over a century, 110 years. That, I think, is more realistic. The fact of the matter is that most individuals don't really change much in the course of their lifetime. Certainly by the time they are 14, 15, or in some cases, at least by the time they're 20, everything is fixed. For many people, it's fixed earlier than that. It's fixed by 9 or 10. But they then, if they have a typical lifespan, spend another 50 or 60 years being around. Meanwhile, further generations are coming, and they may have got their changes. But it means that even if the change is abrupt from the point of view of 1 year to the next of children, it's going to take 60, 70 years to work through society, just because people are still there in society. We don't have an instant change of the population. So no sound change is going to really take effect in much less than about 100 years. And we must always bear that in mind. Nothing is instantaneous, particularly in pronunciation. And I think even more if we're talking about things like glottal stops coming in, diphthongs becoming monophongal and so on, that does take at least 100 years really to take thorough effect. Vocabulary can be much more instantaneous, because we all go on learning vocabulary throughout our life. 10 years ago, I didn't know the word website because the word website hadn't been invented. Now I do know it and I use it. And there are many other similar words. We can all acquire new vocabulary, so that can be instantaneous. Changes in vocabulary, if it's just a matter of adding words and forgetting words, that's straightforward. Do we really change vocabulary? Well, yes, we stop talking about swine and start talking about pigs. There are things like that, but I don't know how to measure that kind of change, because very typically you have a long period of overlap during which both words are in use. Grammatical change, again, I think on the whole, tends to be like pronunciation change in that people stick with more or less the same grammar throughout life. But don't forget, in both grammar and in pronunciation, the importance of stylistic variation, that we don't have one monolithic form of English or whatever language. We have the possibility of varying. We have a casual style, we have a careful style. That applies certainly in pronunciation and certainly in grammar. In my casual grammar, I can use theirs with a plural subject. There's lots of things to do. In my more formal style, in writing, I probably would avoid it and say there are lots of things to do. Similarly, in pronunciation, I have casual pronunciations which I wouldn't use in careful speech. So that too means that changes are not instantaneous. The evidence, such as it is, suggests that things typically progress from being casual to being everyday. And what was one generation's casual speech is the next generation's everyday speech.
But I think that consonants are more resistant to change.
It does look like that, doesn't it? Yes.
And most of the changes that we find in phonetics books are concerned with vowels. For instance, after, or half. They all represent dialectal differences, regional or social. Whereas the consonant or the consonant frame remains, more or less the same.
Yes, not entirely the same.
Being replaced
R and L, H, and of course glottal stops interfering with things. But you're right. But I wonder, is this a parochial fact about English, or is this a universal tendency in all languages? What applies in Japanese? What are the differences between different kinds of Japanese? Vowels or consonants or pitch pattern, or all of them?
All of them.
Well, I mean, this is a serious question, and I don't think I have enough information to answer it, certainly without looking up things in books. What about the Polynesian languages, where we've got, from New Zealand up to Hawaii, through a lot of little different islands? We speak of all these different languages, Tongan, Fijian, and so on. They're all subtly different from one another, but they all share a great deal. As far as I remember, the main differences are consonantal. They're concerned with, whether you have an H or whether you have a glottal stop, whether you have an R or whether you have an L, whether you have a P or a B or an M, rather than vowels. The vowel system is pretty constant. I think that's generally true of Bantu languages as well. If we compare Zulu, Swahili, there are several hundred Bantu languages. They almost all have the same vowel system. On the whole, they tend to have the same vowels in the same words. What they differ in is the consonants. So it could be that it's just an oddity about English that our main difference is of vowels. Perhaps because we have so many vowels, we have such a complex vowel system, and it's so unbalanced, which it is, compared with that of many languages. Your language, Japanese, has a nice balanced system with 5 vowels, all clearly distinct from one another, nicely symmetrical in arrangement. English is not like that, and that's why our vowels are so unstable. You could argue.